In 1977, Larry Ellison, Bob Miner, and Ed Oates came together to create one of the most transformational software companies in history. They took a theoretical idea from a researcher at IBM and they transformed that into a company that now stands at $450 billion in market capitalization with annual revenues exceeding $50 billion. Now, I'm not going to cover their founding story because I think that's already pretty well documented. However, I have spent some time dissecting their strategies on how they got their first customer, their first 10 customers, 100 to 1,000 customers, and how you can sort of take some of the principles that they use to apply that in your own company in the modern world. So let's get straight into it. Now, I've got a document on my right hand side that I'm not going to be reading out massively. You can get a sense of what I'm talking about, and I'm going to take certain excerpts from that. But a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about as well are not going to be on that document at all. So, I mean, if you do want to have that document anyway, then just find me on LinkedIn, shoot me a connection request, and then text me the word Oracle, and then I'll just send this over to you. But let's get started anyway. So, let's talk about the first thing that you would do, right? So let's say with Oracle's case, they just started Oracle. Larry, all three of the founders were working at Ampex, and they needed to get their first customer. They had done some work for the CIA, who was their first customer, by the way, for Oracle. And when they were at Ampex, they had worked on they worked on a specific project for the CIA. So Larry had already developed the connections there. So you basically you shouldn't really be implementing some form of a sales outbound engine from day one. That's not a good idea because you don't actually know the right messaging to convey to your buyers. You probably have a hypothesis, but you don't actually know yet until you get a real market feedback. It's probably not a good idea to be spending money on any form of sales solutions that early on. So, how do you get that? How did Oracle get their first customer? They pretty much used their network, right? So they took this IBM white paper. All three of them had worked. I believe Larry Ellison mainly worked at Ampex, and they basically just used that network to get their foot in the door for the CIA, right? So that was their first customer, right? So the lessons that you can take from getting that first customer is don't be super focused on outbound. If you've got a network, if you've got some form of a network, maybe you've been working for a few years, or potentially maybe you've started a company and you've built up a network, or you built up friends, or you've got family connections, some way, shape, or form, leverage that network to see who could be your first customer. Have like a rough hypothesis of who you want to go after. So normally you would kind of go in one of three directions. The first direction is B2C, so you're selling to consumers. Second is B2B, selling to businesses. And then third is B2G, which is selling to governments. Now, B2B and B2G sort of overlap almost because you're selling to an entity effectively versus an individual. And in Oracle's case, they started by going for government contracts. So they started going for B2G, right? And hence why the CIA was their first customer. So the step for you is to firstly identify the kind of customer segment that you want to go after. So is it B2C, B2B, B2G? If so, okay. Inside of that sort of area, let's say B2B, for example, then what kind of department actually needs what you're trying to sell? What problem are you trying to solve? Who are you solving it for? Get a sense of who that avatar is and try to use network to find people who match that sort of persona. And the reason why you want to use network is because you don't actually know the right messaging yet. You don't understand your buyers completely yet until someone's actually started to pay for your solution. You don't actually know what messaging resonates. You just have hypotheses. So use your network to try to get your way, just to get your foot in the door. If you don't have network, you can do some form of manual sort of outreach. I think that's fine. And the reason you want to do it manual versus automated is because it's just too early to be implementing some form of sales solution this early on before you have any customers. And you just need to focus on just trying to understand your buyer. And if you do things manually to get that first customer, you're going to understand what kind of messaging works and aligns with that kind of buyer. And in fact, like an example for us is right, we didn't implement any real outbound for our first customer at Prospect AI. Our first customer came from referrals. My first mentor actually ended up becoming my first customer, right? So I'd known him for a few years prior, and he ended up becoming our first customer, right? So that's how you can kind of take a similar sort of lesson from Oracle to get that first customer and get past that first hurdle. Now, part two. So you've got your first customer. Now, how do you get from 1 to 10? Right? So you're getting the next 9 customers. So because of the fact that Oracle had started with the CIA, that's a pretty big name to have on inside of like as a customer, right? So they were able to leverage that to gain and expand into other sorts in other sorts of government departments, and they were able to get their next 9 customers by leveraging that name, by leveraging results. So you've got your first customer. So they got their first customer. They already they managed to deliver for them with Oracle V2, which was technically the first version, but they named it V2. And they used that credibility from the CIA to expand into into horizontal departments in the government, right? Into horizontal government branches. And as a result of being able to leverage that success, I guess, that they had with the CIA, they were able to kind of keep going to different departments of the government and getting their next 9 customers, right? Now, what's the core lesson that you can kind of take from this? The first is when you get your first customer, make sure you get some form of testimonial, case study, logo, name reference, whatever you can get from that first customer after you sort of deliver results for them. The second is you still don't want to really be implementing super hardcore sales strategies yet. You're still trying to figure out your buyers. Until you've got your first 10 customers, you don't really fully know who you're trying to serve. You've got an idea, and maybe they all have some form of similar characteristics, right, to align with your hypothesis, but you want to kind of get a sense of why your buyers are going to choose you. So leverage success from one customer to gain access to other buyers. So ask them if they have any friends. You can leverage networking or referrals to gain access to other potential customers. Keep using your grassroots ways. Keep doing things a bit more manually just to get those first 10 customers. And as I mentioned before, it is way too early to even think about implementing a formalized sales process until you've got at least 10 customers, because unless you've got like this really super large ticket offering where you're selling to, let's say, upper mid-market or even enterprise companies, then perhaps maybe having some form of sales process does make sense, because if you are selling to those larger enterprises, you are generally going to be you're probably going to have a more mature product that does require some form of outbound sales strategy. And if that's the case, then yeah, maybe that actually does make sense to actually implement sales, to implement technology where you can sort of start to augment the sales process if you've got something a bit more formalized, especially because the deal cycle takes a while. If you are selling to enterprises, you're going to be spending a good few months minimum to get your foot in the door, if not as high as on the high end, spending a couple of years, right? So, for example, for us at Prospect AI, the way we got our next 9 customers came from a combination of either inbound people coming in and requesting access, or from our own outbound efforts, and we were just cold calling people. So when we started, we were actually just like a database tool where you would basically describe the ideal customers that you wanted to target, and we would go ahead and send you like a list of people, like 25 a day or something, with research on them, research on the company, as well as contact information if we've got it available. So we basically just sort of grassroots, sort of like just cold call people until we could get them in the door. And we did have some form of a sales process almost, like, we would do a discovery call, then a demo call, and then we try to close them. But we were still learning. We were trying to understand why people actually wanted to work with us. So those are some of the lessons that you can take from, I guess, how Oracle did it as well. So make sure you start to leverage what Oracle did. Is obviously they were able to name drop the CIA, which is huge, to other branches, and they were able to leverage the network as well, again, to getting those next customers. They still did do outbound sales, by the way, during this period of time. They were doing a lot of, like Larry Ellison was doing a lot of cold calling. So you can start to implement that. However, I wouldn't recommend really implementing like a fully automated sales process this early, because you still need to get the messaging right. Now let's talk about step 3. or part 3, chapter 3, whatever you want to call it. So this is how Oracle basically went from 10 to 100. So at 10 customers, they already kind of had evidence that they had a solution that was in demand for the marketplace. By this time as well, bear in mind that they were also just targeting super large enterprises, which were, I guess in their case, it was just governments. And the size of the contracts were going to be large. They were going to be in the multiple six figures. And during this process, you should by this point actually understand why people have chosen you. And if you are not completely sure as to why they've chosen you, then there is one simple solution. Just talk to your customers, talk to your users and ask them, why did they pick you? And they might give you a variety of different reasons. They might say something like, hey, this was the perfect solution for me. I was looking for this and I couldn't find anything like this. It could be a market solution, maybe that they realized it was a problem, and they realized it was a problem, but it wasn't a massively urgent problem. But you came to them and you actually helped to develop some level of urgency, which made them realize that they needed to solve this problem. Or it could be something service based. So, for example, you might say, "Hey, your product was really great, but the reason why they went with you is because you gave that extra level of service to them, right? Which they wouldn't have gotten otherwise." So it can be any of those sorts of things. It can even be anything else, by the way. It doesn't matter exactly what it is, but you want to actually pinpoint down the reasons why people went with you, why your first 10 customers went with you. So when you've got that reason, you've got some level of messaging that you can go out with, right? And that's kind of what Oracle sort of did. They had a reason why people had gone with them, and they were able to leverage that messaging in their own sort of outbound, right? So they were doing a bunch of they by this point with their 10 sort of 10 enterprises that they would work with in the government. And maybe there was probably a couple of people a couple of organizations that were non-governmental, so maybe just normal B2B companies. Then what they would have done is they would have taken those reasons, leveraged that inside of the messaging, and then actually started to formalize a sales process, right? So they had actually started to hire salespeople by that point who were going and doing cold calling. So Larry Ellison was able to transition from being the person who was just purely responsible for growing the company to taking that information as like a playbook almost, translating that into killer salespeople who could go out and execute for him. So he's able to step back from operating in the business and start working on the business and gaining more leverage. So they still focus on enterprises. So they still focus on the core market segment, which was going to be upper end enterprises, because they had like large contracts, and they would have had some level of implemented sales structure in place, and they had the messaging in place, so they were able to use that to drive growth. And they had started to implement their formalized systems, because at this point, based on their revenue, they would have been in the right place to actually start to implement systems. You don't want to implement systems too early, but you also don't want to implement them too late. It's better to implement them too early than too late, but in Oracle's case, they managed to implement it at the right time for them. So what does that mean in terms of something that's translatable for you? So back in Oracle's days, the concept of AI wasn't really prevalent. Like it was a thought experiment. It was an idea that had been in computer science for a while, but it wasn't really talked about. It wasn't really studied as heavily. It wasn't popularized because this was pre-internet days. So everything was really, really manual. So Oracle would have done a lot of cold calling, a lot of direct mailing, a lot of networking, a lot of in-person visits, right? Today, 50 years down the line, you don't actually need to do all of those same things. You could do a lot of those same things, by the way. Like those options are still on the table. However, you can actually implement AI systems in place so that way you don't have to do that. If you've already got your messaging down to a T, you've already got the reasons why people are actually choosing you. You've got your market segment down saying, hey, these are the kind of customers that we can serve. Now the only question is, how do you actually start to scale that? Because when you're going from 10 to 100 or onwards, you are generally looking at scaling that, and in that whole sales process, you're not going to be inside of every single sale, if that makes sense, because it's just going to take up too much time, or it's going to take you too long. So ideally, you'll still be doing some founder-led sales from, let's say, from 10 to maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, But when you start to get to, let's say, 80 or 90, maybe even 100, you might be able to do it on your own. It might be a bit tough. You can still do it. It's still doable. But realistically, you're probably going to want to implement some form of like account executive who can also start to who can actually start to take sales calls for you and start to close deals for you, because you're trying to build something that's more repeatable and sustainable. But what about the top of funnel? How do you actually get that top of funnel? Do you still kind of manually go and do things? No. By that point, you start to implement some form of automation. That's actually the right time to start to implement the automation, because by that, if you're still doing it manually, you can still succeed. It's just gonna take you longer. And if you're trying to condense the gap down and actually focus on getting that higher growth, you want to implement some form of AI system. So, for example, you could use like a tool like Prospect AI, for example, where you can basically translate all of your sales knowledge into the AI system relatively quickly, implement the messaging that you kind of need to the things that you want to communicate, and how you want your AI sales clones to communicate with your prospects, and find those prospects for you with their contact information. And as a result, your entire top of funnel is basically taken care of. So the only things that you can do is focus on leverage and closing those deals, and focus on recruiting and bringing on a account executive who's competent to close deals and follow your playbook. Now, if anything I've said seems remotely interesting to you, I left a link down below to my calendar in case you want to take a look at it. Again, only do this if you've already gone past the first 10 customers. Don't do this if you're still early trying to figure things out. It's not a good idea. Focus on those grassroots approaches that I mentioned. But if you're already at that place where you're in that scaling phase, where you are trying to grow revenue really quickly and just want to start to step away from the day-to-day operations and let your top of funnel come in automatically with an AI sales clone, then go ahead and book a time down below, and then we'll be happy to have a chat. So that's step 3. You want to basically try to evangelize your sales team and get them, pumped, and you're in that phase now where you've actually started to scale, right? You're in that scaling phase. You're going to repeat that same process. Same channel, by the way. You're still sticking with one sort of approach. You don't want to do too many channels for your cold outbound. So, chapter 4, how Oracle went from 100 to 1,000 customers. So, by this point, they'd already established some form of repeatable sales process, and they already had some sales reps. Now the key differentiator from getting from 10 to 100 and 100 to 1,000 is expanding that army, building out some form of formalized hierarchical structure where you don't just have a few people who are just focused on selling and actually like bringing in interest and actually closing those deals, but you have someone also managing them as well, making sure that they are hitting quota, establishing quotas, building forecasts. So the core sort of differentiator between the two is with 10 to 100, it is still kind of scrappy in the sense that you're still, as a founder, you're still going to be involved in the day-to-day of that sort of a lot of the founder-led sales related things, and dealing with post-sale success, customer support, that sort of thing. You're probably still going to be hands-on, and then eventually start to transition out slowly by hiring an account executive, maybe a customer success manager. And now with 100 to 1,000, you should have generally probably transitioned away from that entire sales process, and you would have built up. You're in that process where you're now starting to actually build up a team of closers. You're starting to build up some level of management as well, where there's somebody managing the sales. They're managing the salespeople, so you don't have to. They're also going to be building out some form of forecasting over the quarter, over the year, making sure that goals can be hit. And that's basically what Oracle did. Every single sales rep had a quota, and they also carved up different territories of states, cities that they wanted to target, companies that they wanted to work with, and each rep had their own territory that they had to start to build, that they had to start to prospect into and start to actually close those deals. And they also started hiring sales managers to manage people in different territories to make sure that every single goal to make sure that goals were still being hit, that KPIs were being met, and people were hitting quota. The next thing they did was they started using longer sales contracts. So it's a very common strategy in enterprise sales where you start to implement multi-year agreements with these larger enterprise companies in order to have that sticky sort of retention. So instead of someone paying you, let's say let's say I'm going to make up some numbers here, but let's say $500,000 a year is what you charge for an enterprise company. Instead of charging them $500,000 a year for, let's say, 5 years, and you have a different contract every single year, instead you might say, okay, let's do a 5-year contract, but instead of 2.5 million, they'll knock it down to say 2.3 million or 2.2 million or something like that. So what that does is it gives you that longer term revenue, even if the technical revenue per year is a lot shorter. You're still locking in that revenue over a long period of time. So that means that customer isn't going to churn. They're not going to leave your product after 1 year. It's going to be sticky. And he started doing that very, very aggressively. So they would implement crazy discounts to get people to stay, to sign on and pay and stay for a few years. And they were rewarded for that as well. And outside of that, they also started doing a lot more marketing, and they started transitioning away from doing just one channel of outreach, which is just pure sales. They also started doing a bunch of other things as well regarding marketing. Their name started getting out there a bit more, so they started dealing with a bit of inbound as well. And this is kind of a stage where you can start to exploring different channels, right? So again, this might not always be the case, right? You have to hit 100 customers before you start doing different channels, by the way. But if you do hit 100 customers through one channel, you're generally in a good position where you've been able to identify a market segment that needs your product, and you've been able to close 100 deals. You've got generally some form of a sales playbook that can be implemented. You now are just getting people to come in and execute. So you're stepping back from the process, and now you're no longer the person executing, you're the person strategizing, and those people are executing for you. You start to implement larger deals or more favorable deals on longer terms to ensure you get stickier revenue. And then finally, you can start to look at additional channels for growth. So for example, outside of, let's say you just did outbound sales to get your first set of customers, you can now start to implement other channels, maybe say digital ads, or potentially you could start going to networking events or hosting events or going to conferences or doing content marketing, for example. So you could start to implement different sorts of channels, because that way you're away from the grassroots of just trying to get anybody in the door, and it's more so to do with trying to use leverage to actually build exposure. One other thing I'll also mention as well is that if you do end up with certain customers that are growing, which most of these companies that you probably are going to be working with, a lot of them are probably going to be in that sort of growth phase potentially. So if they are growing, then what you can do over time is you can sort of expand the existing client base without having to work on net new customers, if that makes sense. So you're making each customer more valuable rather than just focusing on net new expansion. You should still do that, by the way. But let's say you've got a customer that's growing their headcount, say 10 to 20% per year, and maybe part of that growth means that there's more seat expansion inside of your product, then you can actually go to your end customer and say, hey, we can actually offer you some additional seats, maybe at a discounted rate as well. So that might be an incentive as well to also grow their strategies. And that's what Oracle also did, is that they would use account managers effectively, right? So account managers are going to be taking over the relationship of a specific customer, and their job is basically to focus on making sure that renewals go through all smoothly, and their other job is to build the relationships with the end client and expand the revenue per customer, so that each customer is spending more and more with you each year. So you can also start to look at that as well during that sort of phase of growth. And that's pretty much it. That's how, at least from my research, that Oracle went from basically just an idea to getting their first 1,000 customers. Now, this isn't going to be something that's going to take you 10 seconds, by the way, to do. This is going to be something that you're going to be doing over a course of a few years, realistically. And that's okay, especially if you are going for higher ticket sales. If you're doing lower ticket, then it won't take you as long. But by this is pretty much what I found that Oracle did, and hopefully you found some of the things that I've shared as well to be useful and translatable for your company, whatever you might be selling. And if you did find anything really helpful in this video and you are past that 10 customer point and you are looking to try to scale your outbound, then please click the link down below inside of my calendar. Feel free to book a time to chat, see if we can implement some form of AI sales outreach for you. And if you're interested in this document, shoot me over a connect on LinkedIn and I'll send this over your way. Cheers.